Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are opening up a truly fascinating explainer based on a 19th century theological text. We're going to examine a historical case study that lays out a highly detailed, step-by-step argument identifying the papacy as the biblical man of sin. Now, regardless of your personal background, analyzing how historical texts synthesized biblical prophecy with actual European history is just an incredible exercise in focused learning. The author builds a really methodical thesis here, and we're going to walk through that exact structure today.
Okay, let's dive into this outline. Our six-part chronological journey is going to cover the prophecy of the Antichrist, the great falling away, the rise of the papal system, the counterfeit kingdom, blasphemous claims, and finally, persecutions and the Dark Ages.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the prophecy of the Antichrist, decoding Paul and Daniel's warnings.
So our source text begins with a core premise. It points out that the Apostle Paul warned early Christians that a specific falling away had to happen before Christ's return, and this would culminate in a man of sin. But here is where it gets really interesting, the linguistic breakdown of the word Antichrist. Now, the first meaning is pretty obvious, right? Against Christ, an enemy. But it's the second meaning that the author builds their entire thesis on, instead of, meaning a counterfeit. The text argues that the prophesied Antichrist wasn't going to be some outspoken external enemy, but rather a subtle, systemic counterfeit operating right from within the professed Christian church itself.
And that brings us to Section 2, the great falling away, from humility to hierarchy.
The author essentially maps this biblical prophecy directly onto European history to show us that this falling away definitely wasn't an overnight event. It was a gradual corruption spanning centuries. If we track the church's profound shift over about 400 years, we start in the 1st century with a persecuted minority. They're humble, absolutely no worldly rank. But by the 3rd century, you start seeing an organized polity emerge, complete with wealthy dioceses, and then bam, the pivotal 4th century hits. Christianity gets legalized, it allies with the Roman state, and pagan ceremonies are actively adopted. Literally, the persecuted became the powerful.
Moving on to Section 3, the rise of the papal system. The hindrance removed.
So you might be wondering, how exactly did this religious body gain such immense earthly power? Well, the Apostle Paul actually prophesied that a specific hindering force had to be removed first. The author argues that this hindrance was none other than the Roman emperor himself. See, as long as a pagan emperor held the title of Pontifex Maximus, the Bishop of Rome couldn't exactly claim ultimate authority. But then a massive shift happens. First, Constantine legalizes Christianity and moves the empire's capital out east to Constantinople. Second, the city of Rome is effectively abandoned by the emperors. And third, this creates a massive power vacuum, perfectly allowing the Bishop of Rome to step in as a temporal ruler and claim that old, highly symbolic title of Pontifex Maximus for himself.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the counterfeit kingdom, a false millennial reign.
Because the church had acquired so much immense wealth, the text argues that the leaders essentially lost sight of Christ's future return. Instead, they decided to just set up an earthly kingdom right then and there. And this table brilliantly illustrates how the author systematically contrasts the true type promised in Scripture with what they called the papal counterfeit. Where Scripture promised Christ as high priest, the popes took that place. Where it promised a glorified church, bishops and prelates took the power. And instead of waiting for a heavenly kingdom, an earthly hierarchy was built to enforce obedience using actual state power. The author sees this as a totally fraudulent, premature replica.
Section 5, blasphemous claims. The great swelling words.
Prophecies in Daniel and Revelation speak of a power uttering great swelling words and blasphemies. But to really grasp this, we need to clarify how the source actually defines blasphemy. Because it's not just using profanity or coarse language, right? The deep theological definition is to attribute to God something contrary to his nature, or for a human being to literally claim divine authority and the power to modify divine law. In this view, usurping God's place on earth is the absolute ultimate blasphemy.
The text highlights several massive doctrinal shifts as the actual mechanisms of this self-exaltation and control. We're talking about claiming infallibility for the Pope, actively proscribing and hiding the translated Bible from everyday people, establishing the unbiblical doctrine of purgatory to essentially create fear, and ultimately selling indulgences to cancel out sins. The author points out that these weren't just innocent theological errors, they were highly calculated steps away from original teachings designed to consolidate earthly temporal power.
And the author actually backs up these claims using exact historical decrees. Take a listen to this quote from Pope Boniface VIII. "We declare, say, define, pronounce it necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff." The source text uses this as primary evidence of systemic self-exaltation, arguing that placing a human leader as the absolute, unquestionable gatekeeper to salvation perfectly mirrors those prophetic warnings of a power showing itself to be God.
And then, of course, we have this infamous 16th century quote from John Tetzel, who was the chief agent for selling indulgences in Germany. He said, "The very moment that the money chinks against the bottom of the chest, the soul escapes from purgatory." The source views this exact historical moment as the absolute pinnacle of theological corruption. I mean, they were literally turning the forgiveness of sins into a financial transaction just to fund the building of cathedrals.
Which brings us to our final pillar today in Section 6. Persecutions and the Dark Ages, wearing out the saints.
The biblical prophecy stated clearly that the Antichrist would wear out the saints of the Most High. The author's argument here is that this counterfeit kingdom required brutal physical enforcement to maintain its absolute authority. And the text makes a really fascinating contrast here. Under pagan Rome, persecutions were generally brief, localized frenzies. But by contrast, papal Rome's persecutions were centuries-long, highly systematic crusades directed against entire communities. The author argues that this relentless, sustained violence perfectly aligns with the specific prophecy of wearing out the saints over time.
So who exactly were these persecuted groups? Well, the source identifies communities like the Waldenses, the Albigenses, the Wyclifites, and the Huguenots. These were groups who quietly, and sometimes very loudly, resisted the papal system. They rejected doctrines like purgatory and indulgences, and they demanded open access to the scriptures. The author identifies these specific groups as the true, historical saints of the Most High, who courageously held the line during the Dark Ages.
And the crucial point here really comes down to this stark figure, 60,000. According to the historical sources cited by our author, this is the estimated number of citizens who perished in a single day at the city of Béziers during the Albigensian Crusades. It's a chilling number for sure, but it's presented to underline the devastating earthly cost of a religious system wielding completely unchecked state power.
We've covered a massive amount of historical and theological ground today, tracing this argument from the 1st century all the way through the Dark Ages. I want to leave you with this final thought. If a historical system so closely mirrors ancient prophetic warnings, how does that reshape our understanding of spiritual authority today? Whether you view this 19th century text as absolute truth or simply a masterclass in theological argumentation, it forces us to look very closely at history, power, and the structures we put our trust in. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking closely at the past.